The rain fell in cold, relentless sheets that November afternoon, drumming against the rusted dumpster like 1,000 tiny fists demanding attention. The alley behind Maple Street was empty, silent, except for the hiss of water against asphalt and the distant rumble of traffic. No one noticed the cardboard box tumbling from the back of a pickup truck, landing with a wet slap beside a pile of black garbage bags. No one cared that inside that box, soaked and forgotten, lay the entire truth of a man's life. Arthur Pendleton had died 3 days earlier in room 14 of Riverside Nursing Home, alone except for a night nurse who barely looked up from her phone as his breathing finally stopped. He was 92 years old. The obituary in the local paper was 4 lines long. No military honors were mentioned. No service was planned. His grandsons, Tyler and Marcus, had other priorities. "Just get rid of everything," Tyler had said, standing in the doorway of Arthur's small rental house scrolling through his phone. "Anything worth selling goes on eBay. The rest is trash." Marcus had nodded, already calculating the property value. Neither of them had visited their grandfather in the last 5 years. Neither remembered his birthday. Neither asked about the box. The house had smelled of old coffee and dust, the kind of smell that clings to places where time moves slowly and alone. Arthur's possessions were few: a worn recliner with duct tape holding the armrest together, a small television from the 1990s, shelves lined with paperback westerns, their spines cracked and faded. In the bedroom closet, pushed far into the back corner beneath a stack of yellowed newspapers, sat a shoebox. It was unremarkable, the kind that once held a pair of work boots. The cardboard was soft with age, the corners reinforced with brittle tape. Tyler had grabbed it without looking inside. "Probably just old receipts," he'd muttered, tossing it into the trash pile. That was how Arthur Pendleton's entire truth ended up in a dumpster on Maple Street, waiting to be crushed and forgotten forever. But the universe, in its strange and quiet way, had other plans. Liam Torres pushed his shopping cart slowly down the alley, the wheels squeaking in rhythm with his steps. He was 34 years old but looked older, his face weathered by years of sleeping rough and working under the sun. His cart was his livelihood, filled with copper wire, aluminum cans, scrap metal, anything he could sell to the recycling yard on 5th Street. It wasn't much, but it was honest, it was survival. He almost didn't see the box. It was wedged between 2 garbage bags, already soaked through, the cardboard sagging and dark with rain. Most people would have walked past. Most people would have assumed it was trash because that's what it was supposed to be. But Liam had learned long ago that people threw away more than garbage. They threw away pieces of themselves, pieces of their stories, pieces they didn't want to carry anymore. He stopped, crouched down, pulled the box free. The lid came off easily, the cardboard so wet it barely held together. Inside, protected by a layer of plastic grocery bags, were letters, dozens of them tied together with string. Beneath the letters, wrapped in a faded cloth, was something metal, heavy, cold. Liam lifted it carefully. A medal. It was tarnished, the ribbon frayed and stained, but even in the grey light of the alley, he could see the embossed eagle, the words etched into the bronze. He didn't know military decorations well, but he knew enough to recognize that this wasn't some participation trophy. This was real. This meant something. He looked at the letters. The top envelope was addressed in careful, slanted handwriting. "To whoever finds this, please read. Please remember." Liam sat down on the wet pavement, his back against the dumpster, and began to read. The first letter was dated April 12, 1968. "Dear Margaret, I don't know if this will reach you. I don't know if I'll reach you, but I need to write it down, because if I don't, I think I'll lose my mind. We lost Jenkins today. He was 19. He had a picture of his dog in his helmet. I don't know who's going to tell his mother. I'm not a soldier, Maggie. I never wanted to be. But they needed medics and I couldn't say no. So here I am, carrying bandages instead of bullets, trying to keep boys alive long enough to see home again. I'm scared. I'm so scared, but I can't let them see it. I love you. I'll come home. I promise." Arthur Liam's hands trembled as he unfolded the next letter, and the next. Each one was a window into a world he'd only seen in movies, a world of mud and blood and fear. But these weren't the letters of a hero. They were the letters of a man trying to survive, trying to hold on to his humanity in a place designed to strip it away. The rain continued to fall, but Liam didn't move. He read every word. By the time he reached the 10th letter, the story had begun to take shape. Arthur Pendleton had been a medic in Vietnam, assigned to a platoon operating near the Cambodian border. He wasn't a fighter. He didn't carry a rifle. His weapon was a canvas bag filled with gauze, morphine, and hope. The letters described long nights in the jungle, the sound of helicopters overhead, the way fear tasted like copper in your mouth. But it was the letter dated June 3rd, 1968, that changed everything. Dear Margaret, I don't know how to write this. I don't know how to make sense of it, but I need to tell someone, and you're the only one who'll understand. We were ambushed 2 days ago. 17 men in our platoon. We were supposed to be doing a routine patrol, but nothing's routine here. They hit us from 3 sides, gunfire everywhere, explosions, screaming. I wasn't supposed to fight, that's not my job. My job is to save people. But when the bullets started flying, there was no difference between fighter and medic. There was only survival. Lieutenant Graves went down first, then Cooper, then Daniels. I ran to them one by one, dragging them into cover, patching holes that shouldn't exist in human bodies. I used every bandage I had. I used my shirt. I used my hands. By the time the firing stopped, 9 men were down, 3 were dead, 6 were bleeding out. The choppers couldn't land. The LZ was too hot. Command said we had to move 5 kilometers south to the extraction point. 5 kilometers through the jungle, carrying wounded men, with the enemy still out there. No one thought we'd make it, but I couldn't leave them. I wouldn't. I carried Daniels first. He was the worst. Shrapnel in his chest, bleeding from his mouth. I put him on my back and started walking. The others followed, carrying whoever they could. It took us 11 hours to cover those 5 kilometers. 11 hours of mud and blood, and praying the enemy wouldn't find us. We made it. All 6 of them lived. They want to give me a medal, Maggie. They say I'm a hero, but I'm not. I just couldn't let them die. I couldn't. I'll be home soon. I promise. Arthur Liam lowered the letter, his vision blurred. He looked at the medal in his hand, understanding now what it represented. This wasn't just a piece of metal. This was proof. Proof that one man, terrified and unarmed, had carried 6 dying soldiers through hell and brought them home, and his family had thrown it away. Liam spent the next 3 hours in the alley, reading every letter, piecing together the life of Arthur Pendleton. The letters stopped after 1968, but there were other things in the box. A faded photograph of a young man in uniform, smiling awkwardly at the camera. A newspaper clipping from 1969 announcing his return home, a wedding invitation, a birth announcement. There were also letters from other people. Letters from men named Cooper, Daniels, Ramirez, thanking Arthur for saving their lives. Letters from their wives, their children, telling him he'd given them a future. Letters that said, over and over, "You are the reason we're alive." But there was nothing recent. No letters from the last 20 years. No photographs of grandchildren. No evidence that anyone had cared. Liam carefully placed everything back in the box, wrapping the medal in the cloth, tying the letters together. He stood, his knees stiff from sitting in the rain, and placed the box gently in his shopping cart. He didn't know what he was going to do with it yet, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. This story wasn't going to end in a dumpster. The Riverside Public Library was warm and dry, a refuge from the cold November rain. Liam sat at one of the public computers, the box on the table beside him, and began to search. Arthur Pendleton, Vietnam War, medic. The results were sparse. A few mentions in military databases, a brief entry in a veterans registry. Nothing substantial, nothing that captured the truth of what he'd done. Liam tried a different approach. He searched for the men named in the letters: Daniels, Cooper, Ramirez. One by one he found them. Most were still alive, scattered across the country, living quiet lives with families and grandchildren, lives that existed because Arthur Pendleton had refused to let them die. He found an email address for a man named Robert Daniels in Ohio. Liam hesitated, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. What was he supposed to say? "Hi, I'm a homeless guy who found your medic's life story in the trash." But the letters deserved more than silence. He began to type. "Dear Mr. Daniels, my name is Liam Torres. I found something that I think you need to know about. It's about a man named Arthur Pendleton. I believe he saved your life in 1968. He died 3 days ago. His family threw away his medals and letters. I found them in the trash. I think you'd want to know." He attached a photo of the medal and one of the letters, then hit send before he could change his mind. The response came 18 hours later. Oh my God. That's all it said at first, just those 3 words. Then a few minutes later, a longer message. "Arthur Pendleton saved my life. I was 20 years old, bleeding out in the jungle, and he carried me 5 kilometers on his back. I wouldn't be here without him. My children wouldn't be here. My grandchildren wouldn't be here. I tried to find him after the war. I wrote letters. I called, but I never heard back. I thought maybe he didn't want to be reminded. I thought maybe he'd moved on. I can't believe he's gone. I can't believe his family did that. Please, please tell me where you are. I need to do something. We all do." Liam stared at the screen, his throat tight. He typed back the address of the library. 3 days later, Liam stood outside the Riverside Community Center, holding the box, watching as cars began to pull into the parking lot. He'd expected maybe 1 or 2 people. He hadn't expected this. Robert Daniels arrived first, a man in his 70s, with silver hair and a firm handshake. Behind him came others: Michael Cooper, now a retired teacher from California; Luis Ramirez, a grandfather from Texas; families, children, people whose lives existed because of Arthur Pendleton. They gathered in the community center's main hall, a modest room with folding chairs and fluorescent lights. Liam stood at the front, the box on a table beside him, feeling completely out of place. "I'm not good at speeches," he began, his voice shaking. "I'm just a guy who found something that didn't belong in the trash." He opened the box. He held up the medal. This belonged to Arthur Pendleton. He died alone in a nursing home. His grandsons threw this away because they didn't think it was worth anything. The room was silent. "But it's worth everything," Liam continued, "because this medal represents 6 lives. And those 6 lives represent families, children, grandchildren, futures that wouldn't exist without him." He began to read the letters aloud, his voice growing stronger with each word. He read about the ambush, the 11-hour march, the refusal to leave anyone behind. He read the letters from the men Arthur saved, letters filled with gratitude and love. By the time he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Robert Daniels stood, his hands trembling. "Arthur Pendleton gave me 74 years I shouldn't have had," he said, his voice breaking. "He gave me a wife, 3 children, 7 grandchildren. He gave me everything, and I never got to thank him." He looked at Liam. "But we can thank him now." If you believe every life holds a story worth remembering, subscribe to this channel and join our community. The next week moved like a quiet storm, gathering strength in ways Liam couldn't have predicted. Robert Daniels made phone calls, lots of them. He contacted the other men from the platoon, the ones who were still alive, the ones whose lives had been stitched back together by Arthur's hands. He reached out to veterans organizations, local news stations, anyone who would listen. The story began to spread. A reporter from the Riverside Gazette came to interview Liam at the library. She was young, maybe 25, with a notebook and a skeptical expression that softened as he showed her the letters. She took photographs of the medal, of the faded handwriting, of Liam's weathered hands holding pieces of history. The article ran on the front page 3 days later. "Local man rescues war hero's legacy from trash." The headline felt too simple, too clean. It didn't capture the weight of what had been lost, what had been found. But it was enough. People started showing up at the library, asking to see the letters, wanting to know more about Arthur Pendleton. Veterans came, some in wheelchairs, some leaning on canes, all of them with the same look in their eyes. Recognition, grief, anger that one of their own had been forgotten. Liam kept the box with him at all times now, afraid that if he let it out of his sight, it would disappear again. He slept with it beside his sleeping bag under the overpass on 4th Street, wrapped in plastic to keep it dry. He didn't trust anyone else to protect it. It was on a Tuesday morning, exactly 9 days after he'd found the box, that everything changed. Liam was sitting on the library steps drinking coffee from a styrofoam cup when a silver BMW pulled up to the curb. 2 men got out, both in their 30s, both wearing expensive jackets and expressions of barely concealed irritation. Tyler and Marcus Pendleton. Liam recognized them immediately from the news article, which had included a brief mention of Arthur's surviving family. They looked exactly like the kind of men who would throw away a shoebox without looking inside. "You're the guy," Tyler said, not bothering with introductions. "The one who found our grandfather's stuff." Liam stood slowly, setting down his coffee. "Yeah, that's me. We need it back," Marcus said flatly. "It's family property. You had no right to take it." "I didn't take it," Liam replied, his voice calm. "I found it in the trash where you put it." Tyler's jaw tightened. "That's not the point. It belongs to us. We're his legal heirs." "Legal heirs," Liam repeated, tasting the words. "You threw away his medals, his letters, everything that mattered about him, and now you want it back?" "Look," Marcus said, stepping closer, his tone shifting to something meant to sound reasonable. "We didn't know what was in the box, okay? We made a mistake, but it's still ours. And there are people willing to pay good money for authentic Vietnam memorabilia." There it was. The truth, naked and ugly. They didn't want to honor their grandfather. They wanted to sell him. Liam felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. "No, excuse me," Tyler's voice rose. "You can't just—" "I can," Liam interrupted, "because I'm the one who pulled it out of the trash. I'm the one who read the letters. I'm the one who found the men your grandfather saved, and I'm the one who's going to make sure his story gets told the right way." "We'll sue you," Marcus threatened. "We'll get the police involved." "Go ahead," Liam said quietly. "Explain to a judge why you threw away a war hero's medals. Explain it to the newspaper. Explain it to the men whose lives he saved. I'm sure that'll go great for you." The brothers exchanged a glance, uncertainty flickering across their faces. "This isn't over," Tyler said finally, turning back to the car. "Yeah," Liam replied, watching them drive away. "It is." The confrontation made the news. The Gazette ran a follow-up story. "Grandson demands return of discarded war medals. Veteran advocates push back." The backlash was immediate and fierce. Social media exploded with outrage. Veterans groups issued statements condemning the family's actions. Someone started a petition demanding that Arthur Pendleton receive a proper memorial. Within 48 hours, it had 15,000 signatures. Tyler and Marcus went silent, their social media accounts deleted, their phones disconnected. But the damage was done. Their names were now permanently linked to a story about greed and disrespect, a story that would follow them forever. Liam didn't feel victorious. He just felt tired. The ceremony was planned for the following Saturday at Riverside Park, a small green space near the center of town, with old oak trees and a gazebo that had hosted 100 weddings and community events. The veterans organizations had taken over the planning, coordinating with the city council, arranging for a plaque inviting everyone who had been touched by Arthur's story. Liam hadn't expected it to be so big. By the time he arrived, there were over 200 people gathered around the gazebo. Veterans in uniform, families with children, reporters with cameras. A small stage had been set up, draped with an American flag. On the stage sat the box, carefully preserved now in a glass case. Robert Daniels found Liam in the crowd and pulled him into a fierce hug. "You did this," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You made this happen." "I just found a box," Liam replied. "No," Robert said firmly. "You found a man. You found his truth, and you refused to let it die." The ceremony began with a speech from the mayor, a polished woman in her 50s who spoke about service and sacrifice and the importance of remembering. It was fine, Liam supposed, but it felt distant, like she was reading from a script. Then Robert Daniels took the stage. He didn't have notes. He didn't need them. "In June of 1968, he began, his voice steady and clear, "I was 20 years old, and I was dying. I had shrapnel in my chest, blood in my lungs, and I was certain I'd never see home again. But there was a man, a medic named Arthur Pendleton, who refused to accept that." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd. Arthur wasn't a fighter. He didn't carry a gun. He carried bandages and morphine and hope. And when our platoon was ambushed, when half of us were bleeding out in the jungle, he didn't run. He didn't hide. He picked us up, one by one, and he carried us to safety. Robert's voice broke. "He carried me 5 kilometers on his back, 5 kilometers through mud and blood and enemy territory. And he did it because he couldn't leave me behind. He couldn't leave any of us behind." He held up a photograph, blown up and mounted on a board. Arthur Pendleton at 23, smiling awkwardly in his uniform. "This is the man who gave me my life. This is the man who gave me my family. And this is the man whose grandsons threw his medals in the trash." A murmur rippled through the crowd, anger and disbelief mixing in equal measure. "But this is also the man," Robert continued, his voice rising, "who was saved by a stranger, a man named Liam Torres, who saw value where others saw garbage, who saw a story worth telling when others saw nothing." He gestured to Liam, who stood frozen at the edge of the crowd. "Liam, come up here." Liam shook his head, but the crowd was already parting, hands gently pushing him forward. He climbed the steps to the stage, his heart pounding, feeling completely out of place. Robert handed him the microphone. "I don't know what to say," Liam admitted, his voice barely audible. "Just tell them why," Robert said softly. Liam looked out at the crowd, at the faces watching him. Veterans, families, strangers who had come to honor a man they'd never met. "I found the box in the rain," he began, his voice shaking. I almost didn't stop. I almost just walked past because it looked like trash, but something made me look inside. He paused, trying to find the right words. I've spent a lot of my life being invisible. People look through me, not at me. I'm just another guy pushing a cart, another face they don't want to see. But when I read those letters, I realized that Arthur was invisible too. Not because he was homeless or poor, but because people forgot. They stopped seeing him. They stopped caring. His voice grew stronger. And I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't let his story end in a dumpster, because if we forget people like Arthur, people who gave everything and asked for nothing, then what does that say about us? The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. Arthur Pendleton saved 6 lives, Liam continued, but those 6 lives became families, children, grandchildren. Hundreds of people exist because he refused to give up. And that's not just a story. That's a legacy. That's everything. He looked down at the glass case, at the medal and the letters. So I'm not the hero here. Arthur is. I just made sure people knew. The applause started slowly, then built into a roar. People stood, clapping, some wiping tears from their eyes. Liam stood there overwhelmed, not knowing what to do with the weight of their gratitude. Robert put a hand on his shoulder. "You did good," he said simply. After the speeches, the mayor unveiled the plaque, a simple bronze marker mounted on a stone base near the gazebo. It read, "In memory of Arthur Pendleton, U.S. Army medic, Vietnam War, who carried the wounded and refused to leave anyone behind, 1947-2024. The measure of a life is not in what we take, but in what we give." The crowd gathered around it, taking photographs, laying flowers. Veterans saluted. Children asked their parents questions. Liam stood apart, watching, feeling the weight of the medal in his pocket. Robert had tried to give it to him during the ceremony, insisting that he'd earned it. But Liam had refused. It didn't belong to him. Except now, standing here, he realized that maybe it did. Not because he'd earned it through combat or heroism, but because he was the only one who understood its true value. He was the guardian now, the keeper of Arthur's truth. And he would carry that responsibility for the rest of his life. The sun was setting by the time the crowd began to disperse, casting long shadows across the park. Liam sat on a bench near the plaque, the box beside him, watching families pack up their picnic blankets and head home. A woman approached him, older, maybe 70, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "You're Liam, aren't you?" she asked. He nodded. "I'm Margaret," she said, sitting down beside him. "Margaret Pendleton, Arthur's wife." Liam's breath caught. "I didn't know. I thought that I was dead," she smiled sadly. "No, just absent. We divorced in 1985. Arthur came back from the war different, quieter. He wouldn't talk about what happened over there. He just shut down. I tried for 17 years, but eventually I had to let go." She looked at the plaque, her eyes glistening. "I didn't know about the letters," she continued. "He never told me. He never told anyone. He just carried it all inside like it was too heavy to share." "I'm sorry," Liam said quietly. "Don't be," Margaret replied. "You gave him something I couldn't. You gave him a voice. You made sure people knew." She reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope, handing it to Liam. "This is for you. Arthur would have wanted you to have it." Liam opened the envelope. Inside was a check for $5,000. "I can't," he started. "Yes, you can," Margaret said firmly. "Arthur had a small life insurance policy. The boys were supposed to get it, but after what they did, I made sure it went somewhere better. Use it to get back on your feet, get a place to stay. Arthur would have wanted that." Liam stared at the check, his vision blurring. "Thank you," he whispered. Margaret stood, patting his shoulder gently. "No," she said softly. "Thank you." That night, Liam didn't sleep under the overpass. He used some of Margaret's money to rent a motel room. Nothing fancy, just a clean bed and a door that locked. He set the box on the nightstand, the medal beside it, and lay down, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in years, he felt like he had a purpose. Arthur Pendleton had saved 6 lives in the jungle, and in a strange, unexpected way, he'd saved a 7th, Liam's. Because now, Liam had a story to tell. A story about a man who gave everything and asked for nothing. A story about dignity and memory, and the quiet power of refusing to let someone be forgotten. And he would spend the rest of his life making sure that story was heard. Claro, vou prosseguir com o segundo bloco, trazendo as informações necessárias de forma clara e organizada. The weeks following the ceremony moved with a strange momentum, like a river that had found its course after years of being dammed. Liam Torres woke each morning in his small efficiency apartment, the first real home he'd had in 6 years, and felt the weight of Arthur Pendleton's medal on the dresser, a constant reminder that some stories refused to stay buried. He'd used Margaret's money carefully, first month's rent, a security deposit, some basic furniture from the thrift store, and a cheap laptop so he could continue researching Arthur's life. The rest he saved, knowing that stability was fragile and could disappear as quickly as it had arrived. But something had shifted inside him. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was building something. The local veterans organizations had reached out, asking him to speak at events, to share Arthur's story with other communities. At first, he'd refused, uncomfortable with the attention, but Robert Daniels had called him one evening and said something that changed his mind. There are thousands of Arthurs out there, Liam. Men and women who served, who sacrificed, who came home and just faded away. If you can make people see one of them, really see them, maybe they'll start looking for the others. So Liam started saying yes. His first speaking engagement was at a VFW hall in a neighboring town, a cramped room that smelled of coffee and old carpet. 30 people showed up, mostly veterans in their 70s and 80s, their faces carved with the same quiet resignation he'd seen in Arthur's photographs. Liam stood at the front of the room, the glass case with Arthur's medals and letters on the table beside him, and told the story exactly as it had happened. He didn't embellish, he didn't dramatize, he just spoke the truth. When he finished, an old man in the back row stood up, his hands shaking. "I was a medic too," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Korea. I carried men out of frozen hills. I watched boys die in my arms, and when I came home, nobody asked, nobody wanted to know. They just wanted me to be normal again, like nothing had happened." He wiped his eyes. "Thank you for remembering, Arthur. Thank you for making people see." The room erupted in applause, but Liam barely heard it. He was watching the old man's face, seeing the decades of silence finally breaking open, and he understood something profound. Arthur's story wasn't just about one man. It was about all of them. Every forgotten veteran, every untold sacrifice, every life that had been lived in the shadows of history. And somehow, impossibly, Liam had become the person who could bring those shadows into the light. It was during his third speaking engagement at a high school in Riverside that Liam met Sarah Chen. She was a history teacher, mid-40s, with sharp eyes and an intensity that reminded him of the reporters who'd covered Arthur's story. She'd invited him to speak to her students about the importance of preserving personal histories, and Liam had agreed, though he was nervous about talking to teenagers. The auditorium was packed with 200 students, most of them looking at their phones, clearly there because attendance was mandatory. Liam felt his stomach twist as he walked onto the stage, but then he started talking, and something unexpected happened. The phones went down. He told them about finding the box in the rain, about reading the letters, about discovering that the grumpy old man from Maple Street had been a hero. He told them about Tyler and Marcus throwing away their grandfather's legacy, about the ceremony in the park, about the plaque that now stood as a permanent reminder, and he told them why it mattered. "History isn't just about presidents and wars and dates you have to memorize for tests," he said, his voice echoing in the silent auditorium. "History is about people. Real people with real lives who did extraordinary things and then went back to being ordinary. And if we don't remember them, if we don't tell their stories, then they disappear, and when they disappear, we lose part of ourselves." When he finished, the applause was thunderous. Students lined up afterward to see the medals, to touch the letters, to ask questions. One girl, maybe 16, with purple hair and a skeptical expression, asked him something that stopped him cold. "Do you think Arthur knew," she asked, "that his family would throw him away like that?" Liam considered the question carefully. "I think he knew he was alone," he said finally. "I think he knew that the world had moved on without him, but I don't think he knew that someone would find him again. I don't think he knew his story would matter to people he'd never met." The girl nodded slowly, something shifting in her expression. "That's kind of beautiful," she said quietly, in a sad way. After the assembly, Sarah Chen invited Liam to her classroom. It was small and cluttered, the walls covered with maps and timelines and student projects. She poured him coffee from a battered thermos and sat down across from him. "You're good at this," she said without preamble. "Better than most professional speakers I've brought in." Liam shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "I'm just telling the truth." "That's exactly why you're good at it," Sarah replied. "You're not performing. You're not trying to inspire. You're just bearing witness, and that's powerful." She leaned forward, her eyes intense. I want to propose something, a project. I think there are more stories like Arthur's out there, and I think we should find them." Liam frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean we should actively search for forgotten veterans, people who served, who sacrificed, who came home and disappeared into ordinary lives. We document their stories, preserve their memories, make sure they're not lost." She pulled out a folder, spreading papers across the desk. "I've already started. I put out a call on social media, asking people to share stories about veterans in their families who never got recognition. In 2 weeks, I've received over 300 responses. 300, Liam. And that's just from one county." Liam stared at the papers, his mind racing. That's a lot." "It's an epidemic of forgetting," Sarah said quietly. "And I think you're the person who can help fix it." "I'm not a historian," Liam protested. "I'm not a writer, You're the person who saw value in a box everyone else called trash," Sarah interrupted. "You're the person who refused to let Arthur disappear. That's exactly who we need." Liam looked at the folder, at the names and stories waiting to be told, and felt something ignite in his chest. Purpose, direction, a reason to keep going that went beyond simple survival. "Okay," he said, "let's do it." They called it the Last Oaths Project. The name came from one of Arthur's letters, a line that had stuck with Liam. "We took an oath to serve, but the real oath is the one we make to each other, to remember, to honor, to never let the fallen be forgotten." Sarah secured a small grant from the local historical society. Liam used some of his remaining money to buy a better laptop and a digital recorder. They set up a website, created social media accounts, and put out a call for stories. The response was overwhelming. Within a month, they had over 1,000 submissions. Stories of grandfathers who'd stormed beaches in World War II and never spoke of it. Stories of grandmothers who'd served as nurses in Korea and came home to silence. Stories of Vietnam veterans who'd been spit on and forgotten. Stories of men and women from Iraq and Afghanistan who were still alive but already invisible. Liam and Sarah developed a system. They would reach out to families, conduct interviews, collect photographs and documents, and then create detailed profiles that would be archived both digitally and physically. Each profile included a narrative biography, scanned documents, and video interviews when possible. But more importantly, they made sure each story was told publicly. They created a YouTube channel where Liam would present each veteran's story, using the same straightforward, honest approach that had made Arthur's story resonate. They partnered with local newspapers, radio stations, and community organizations to spread the word. The channel grew slowly at first, then exponentially. 10 subscribers became 100, 100 became 1,000. Within 6 months, they had 50,000 subscribers and videos that regularly reached hundreds of thousands of views. People were hungry for these stories. They were hungry for heroes who looked like their neighbors, who'd lived quiet lives, who'd never asked for recognition but deserved it anyway. If this story touched your heart, click like and subscribe to honor those who served. It was during the filming of their 43rd profile that everything nearly fell apart. The veteran's name was James Kirkwood, an 87-year-old man living in a nursing home on the outskirts of town. His daughter had reached out to the project, explaining that her father had served in Vietnam as a helicopter pilot, flying rescue missions into hot zones, pulling out wounded soldiers under heavy fire. "He never talks about it," she'd written, "but I found his medals in a box in his closet, and I think his story deserves to be told before it's too late." Liam and Sarah arrived at the nursing home on a grey Tuesday morning, their equipment packed carefully in backpacks. The facility was clean but institutional, the kind of place where people went to wait for the end. James Kirkwood sat in a wheelchair by the window of his room, staring out at a parking lot. He was thin, his hands spotted with age, his eyes clouded with cataracts. But when Liam introduced himself and explained why they were there, something shifted in the old man's expression. "You want to hear about the war?" James asked, his voice rough with disuse. "Only if you want to tell us," Liam replied gently. James was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I've been waiting 50 years for someone to ask." The interview lasted 3 hours. James spoke slowly at first, his words halting and uncertain, like a machine that hadn't been used in decades. But as he continued, the words came faster, the memories sharper. He described flying into landing zones under fire, the sound of bullets hitting the helicopter's hull, the weight of wounded men being loaded into the cargo bay. "We called it dust-off," he said, his eyes distant. "Emergency medical evacuation. When someone called for dust-off, you went. Didn't matter how hot the LZ was, didn't matter how bad the weather. You went because those boys were dying, and you were their only chance. He described one mission in particular, a rescue in the Ashau Valley, where his helicopter had been hit by enemy fire. The co-pilot was killed instantly. The crew chief was wounded, but James kept flying, kept the bird in the air long enough to extract 12 wounded soldiers before crash landing in a river. I don't remember much after that, he said quietly. I woke up in a hospital in Da Nang. They told me I'd saved 12 lives. They gave me a medal, and then they sent me home. What happened when you got home? Sarah asked gently. James's expression darkened. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. I went back to my job at the factory, got married, had kids, lived a normal life, but nobody asked about the war. Nobody wanted to know. It was like those years just didn't exist. He looked at Liam, his eyes suddenly sharp. Do you know what that does to a person? To carry all that inside, all those memories, all those faces, and have nobody care? Liam nodded slowly. Yeah, I think I do. They finished the interview and packed up their equipment. James's daughter walked them to the door, her eyes red from crying. Thank you, she whispered. I've never heard him talk like that. I didn't know. A lot of people don't, Sarah said gently. That's why we're doing this. They drove back to Riverside in silence, both of them processing what they'd heard. It was only when they were unloading the equipment at Sarah's house that Liam's phone rang. It was James's daughter. He's gone, she said, her voice breaking. He died about an hour after you left. The nurses said he just closed his eyes and stopped breathing. Liam felt the world tilt. I'm so sorry, he managed. Don't be, she said, and he could hear the tears in her voice. You gave him something he'd been waiting for his whole life. You let him be heard. You let him matter. She paused. He was smiling when he died. I've never seen him smile like that. Liam sat in his apartment that night, staring at the footage of James Kirkwood, and felt the weight of what they were doing settle fully onto his shoulders. These weren't just stories. These were last chances, final opportunities to capture voices before they disappeared forever. And every day they delayed, every story they didn't tell, was another life that would fade into silence. He thought about Arthur, about how close his story had come to being lost completely. He thought about James, who'd waited 50 years to be heard and died, hours after finally speaking, and he made a decision. This wasn't just a project anymore. This was his life's work. This was what he was meant to do. He opened his laptop and began editing James's interview, working through the night, determined to make sure the old pilot's voice would echo long after his body was gone. The video of James Kirkwood was published 2 weeks later, titled simply, The Pilot Who Flew into Hell and Never Spoke of It. It went viral within 48 hours, 5 million views, 10 million, 20 million. The comments section filled with thousands of people sharing their own stories of forgotten veterans, of grandfathers and uncles and neighbors who'd served and never been recognized. News outlets picked up the story. National media reached out for interviews. The Last Oaths project suddenly had a spotlight it had never sought, and with that spotlight came scrutiny. The attack came from an unexpected direction. A blogger named Derek Matheson, who ran a website dedicated to exposing fraud in the veteran community, published a lengthy article questioning the authenticity of the Last Oaths project. He claimed that Liam and Sarah were exploiting veterans for profit, that they were fabricating stories to generate views, that the whole thing was a scam designed to solicit donations. The article was filled with half-truths and deliberate misrepresentations, but it was convincing enough to plant seeds of doubt. Comments on their videos turned hostile. Their social media accounts were flooded with accusations. Someone even filed a complaint with the State Attorney General's office, claiming they were running a fraudulent charity. Liam watched it all unfold with a sick feeling in his stomach. We have to respond, Sarah said, pacing her living room. We have to defend ourselves. How? Liam asked. Everything we do is documented. Every story is verified. But people don't care about facts when they've already decided what to believe. So we just let him destroy us? Liam thought about Arthur's letters, about the quiet dignity in those pages, about a man who'd done extraordinary things and never asked for recognition. No, he said slowly. We let the veterans speak for themselves. They organized a press conference at the Riverside Community Center, inviting every veteran they'd profiled who was still alive and able to attend. 32 men and women showed up, ranging in age from 60 to 94, representing wars from Korea to Afghanistan. The room was packed with reporters, cameras, and curious citizens. Derek Matheson sat in the back row, his arms crossed, a smirk on his face. Liam stood at the podium, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. "I'm not going to defend myself," he began, "because this isn't about me. This isn't about Sarah. This is about them." He gestured to the veterans seated behind him. "These are the people whose stories we've told. These are the men and women who served, who sacrificed, who came home and lived quiet lives while the world forgot. And I'm going to let them speak." One by one, the veterans came to the microphone. Robert Daniels spoke about Arthur Pendleton, about being carried 5 kilometers through the jungle, about owing his entire life to a man his grandsons had thrown away. A woman named Patricia Gomez spoke about serving as a nurse in Vietnam, about holding dying boys in her arms, about coming home to a country that called her a baby killer. A man named Thomas Wright spoke about losing both legs in Iraq, about learning to walk again, about being told he was a hero while simultaneously being denied proper medical care by the VA. Each story was a hammer blow, each voice a refutation of the lies being spread. By the time the last veteran finished speaking, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Derek Matheson had left halfway through. The press conference footage was shared millions of times. The accusations evaporated like morning fog. The State Attorney General's office closed their investigation after a single day, issuing a statement praising the Last Oaths Project for their work. But the damage had been done. Liam felt it in the way his hands shook when he tried to edit videos, in the way he couldn't sleep without seeing Derek Matheson's smirking face, in the way he questioned every decision, every word, every story. Sarah found him one evening sitting in his apartment staring at the wall, the laptop unopened beside him. "You can't let him win," she said quietly, sitting down beside him. "He already did," Liam replied. "He made me doubt. He made me question whether any of this matters." "It matters," Sarah said firmly. "You know it matters. James Kirkwood died smiling because you gave him a voice. Arthur Pendleton's story is being taught in schools because you refuse to let it die. That matters." Liam closed his eyes. "What if I can't keep doing this? What if I'm not strong enough?" Sarah took his hand. "Then we'll do it together. You don't have to carry this alone." The Last Oaths Project continued, stronger than before. They established a non-profit organization, bringing in volunteers to help with research and documentation. They partnered with the Library of Congress to create a permanent archive of the stories they collected. They expanded beyond veterans, documenting the lives of first responders, teachers, nurses, anyone whose service had been overlooked or forgotten. But Liam never forgot why he'd started. Every morning, he looked at Arthur Pendleton's medal still sitting on his dresser and remembered the old man who died alone, whose grandsons had thrown away his truth, whose story had been saved by a stranger who saw value where others saw trash. And every morning he made the same promise: "I will remember, I will honor, I will never let the fallen be forgotten." 2 years after finding the box in the rain, Liam stood once again in Riverside Park, surrounded by a crowd of over 1,000 people. The small bronze plaque honoring Arthur Pendleton had been joined by 43 others, each one representing a veteran whose story had been told through the Last Oaths Project. The park had been officially renamed the Garden of Remembrance, a place where people could come to honor those who'd served and been forgotten. It had become a pilgrimage site, a place where families brought their own stories, where veterans gathered to find community, where the invisible became visible. Liam stood at the podium, preparing to speak at the dedication ceremony, and felt the weight of everything that had led to this moment. The rain-soaked alley, the letters tied with string, the medal wrapped in cloth, the choice to stop, to look, to care. 2 years ago, he began, his voice carrying across the silent crowd, I found a box in the trash. Inside that box was the entire truth of a man's life, a man named Arthur Pendleton, who saved 6 lives in Vietnam and then came home to be forgotten. He paused, looking at the faces watching him, young and old, veteran and civilian, people who'd traveled from across the country to be here. But Arthur's story didn't end in that dumpster. It ended here in this garden, surrounded by the stories of others like him, people who gave everything and asked for nothing, people who lived extraordinary lives disguised as ordinary ones, people who deserved to be remembered. He pulled Arthur's medal from his pocket, holding it up for everyone to see. This medal doesn't belong to me. It doesn't belong to Arthur's family. It belongs to all of us because it represents something bigger than one man's heroism. It represents a promise that we will remember, that we will honor, that we will never let service and sacrifice disappear into silence. He placed the medal carefully in a new display case at the center of the garden, beneath a plaque that read, The Last Oath's garden, where the forgotten are remembered, where silence becomes voice, where every life is honored. The crowd erupted in applause, but Liam barely heard it. He was looking at the medal, at the tarnished bronze and frayed ribbon, and thinking about the journey that had brought him here. He'd been invisible once, a man pushing a cart, a face people didn't want to see. But Arthur Pendleton had given him something more valuable than money or recognition. Arthur had given him purpose. That evening, after the ceremony ended and the crowd dispersed, Liam sat alone on a bench in the garden, watching the sun set behind the oak trees. He thought about all the stories still waiting to be told, all the voices still waiting to be heard, all the lives still waiting to be remembered. The work would never be finished. There would always be more Arthurs, more forgotten heroes, more truths buried in boxes and silence. But that was okay, because now there were people who cared, people who were looking, people who understood that every life holds a story worth remembering, and that the measure of a society isn't in how it celebrates its heroes, but in how it honors those who never asked to be celebrated. Liam pulled out his phone and opened the Last Oaths Project website. There were 17 new submissions waiting for review, 17 more stories waiting to be told. He smiled and began to read. 3 months later, on a cold February morning, Liam received a package in the mail. It was small, wrapped in brown paper, with no return address. Inside was a letter and a photograph. The photograph showed a young man in uniform, smiling at the camera, his arm around a woman in a white dress. On the back, in faded ink, was written, "Arthur and Margaret, 1969. The letter was from Margaret Pendleton. "Dear Liam, I'm writing this from a hospital bed, and I'm not sure how much time I have left. The doctors say weeks, maybe days, but I needed to send you this before I go. This photograph was taken the day Arthur and I got married, 2 weeks after he came home from Vietnam. He looks happy in it, doesn't he? That was the last time I saw that smile. The war took it from him, and he never got it back. I've spent 39 years wondering if I did the right thing, leaving him, wondering if I should have tried harder, been more patient, loved him better. But watching what you've done, how you've honored his memory, how you've made his life matter, I realize that some wounds are too deep for one person to heal. Arthur needed the world to see him. He needed to know that what he did mattered, that the boys he saved remembered, that his sacrifice wasn't invisible. And you gave him that even after he was gone. I'm sending you this photograph because I want you to remember something. Arthur was more than a hero. He was a man who loved and hurt and struggled. He was human, and that's what makes his story so important. Don't let the project become just about heroism. Let it be about humanity. Let it be about the messy, complicated, beautiful truth of real lives. Thank you for finding my husband. Thank you for bringing him home." With gratitude, Margaret Liam read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down his face. He placed the photograph carefully in a frame and set it beside Arthur's medal on his dresser. Margaret Pendleton died 4 days later. Liam attended the funeral, along with Robert Daniels and the other men Arthur had saved. They stood together in the cold rain, watching as Margaret was laid to rest beside her ex-husband in the Veterans Cemetery, their names finally side by side again. It felt like the closing of a circle, the end of a story that had begun in a rain-soaked alley 2 years earlier. But it wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. 5 years after finding the box, Liam Torres stood in front of a congressional committee in Washington, D.C., testifying about the need for better preservation of veterans' stories. The Last Oaths Project had grown beyond anything he'd imagined. They'd documented over 3,000 stories, created partnerships with museums and universities, trained volunteers in 50 states, and inspired similar projects around the world. But more importantly, they'd changed the conversation. People were looking at their neighbors differently now, asking questions, seeking stories, refusing to let service and sacrifice fade into silence. Schools were incorporating oral history projects into their curriculums. Nursing homes were hosting storytelling events. Families were sitting down with their elderly relatives and finally asking, "What happened? What did you see? What do you want us to remember?" The epidemic of forgetting was being cured, one story at a time. Liam finished his testimony and returned to his seat, feeling the weight of Arthur's medal in his pocket. He carried it everywhere now, a talisman and a reminder. A senator approached him afterward, an older man with kind eyes. "That was powerful," the senator said. "You've done remarkable work." "It's not my work," Liam replied. "It's theirs. I'm just the person who makes sure people listen." The senator nodded slowly. The world needs more people like you. People who see value where others see trash. Liam smiled, thinking about a rain-soaked alley, a cardboard box, a choice to stop and look. The world needs more people who refuse to forget, he said quietly. That's all. If you believe every life holds a story worth remembering, subscribe to this channel and join our community. 10 years after finding the box, Liam Torres published a book. It was called Last Oaths, Stories of Service, Sacrifice, and the Strangers Who Remembered, and it became an instant bestseller. The book told Arthur's story along with 50 others, each one a testament to the power of memory and the importance of bearing witness. The dedication page read simply, "For Arthur Pendleton, who taught me that every life matters, and for everyone who's ever felt invisible, you're not. I see you." Liam donated all the proceeds to the Last Oaths project, ensuring that the work would continue long after he was gone. He gave talks at universities, at veterans organizations, at community centers across the country. He trained new volunteers, mentored young historians, and continued to personally document stories whenever he could. But his favorite moments were still the quiet ones, sitting across from an elderly veteran, recorder running, listening to a voice that had been silent for decades, finally finding the courage to speak. Those moments reminded him why he'd started, why he'd stopped in that alley, why he'd opened that box. Because every life holds a story worth remembering, and sometimes all it takes is one person willing to listen. 15 years after finding the box, Liam Torres returned to Riverside Park, now officially known as the Last Oaths Garden, for the dedication of a new monument. It was a bronze statue, life-sized, depicting a medic carrying a wounded soldier. The medic's face was Arthur Pendleton's, carefully sculpted from photographs. The soldier's face was left blank, representing all those who'd been saved, all those whose lives continued because someone refused to give up. At the base of the statue was a plaque with the words from Arthur's letter, "We took an oath to serve, but the real oath is the one we make to each other, to remember, to honor, to never let the fallen be forgotten." The garden had grown over the years. There were now over 500 plaques representing 500 stories, 500 lives that had been pulled from the edge of forgetting and given permanent voice. Families came from across the country to visit, to touch the names of their loved ones, to know that their service had been recognized. Veterans came to find community, to share their own stories, to finally feel seen. It had become exactly what Liam had hoped, a place where the invisible became visible, where silence became voice, where memory became legacy. Liam stood before the statue, looking up at Arthur's bronze face, and felt a profound sense of peace. He was 64 years old now, his hair grey, his body marked by the years of hard living that had come before the box. But he was healthy, he was stable, he had a purpose that filled every day with meaning. Sarah Chen stood beside him, now the executive director of the Last Oaths project, overseeing a staff of 40 and a volunteer network of thousands. "We did it," she said softly. "We actually did it. Arthur did it," Liam replied. "We just made sure people knew." Robert Daniels approached, now 93 years old, moving slowly with a cane but still sharp-eyed and clear-voiced. "I've been thinking," Robert said, looking at the statue, "about what Arthur would say if he could see all this." "What do you think he'd say?" Liam asked. Robert smiled. "I think he'd say it was too much, that he was just doing his job, that he didn't deserve all this attention." "He'd be wrong," Sarah said firmly. "Yes," Robert agreed. "He would be. But that's what made him who he was. He never asked for recognition. He just did what needed to be done, and then he went home and lived his life." He turned to Liam. "You're the same way, you know. You could have sold that medal, made money off Arthur's story, turned this into something about you, but you didn't. You made it about them, about all of them." Liam shook his head. "I just opened a box." "No," Robert said, his voice firm. "You opened a door, and you invited the whole world to walk through it." That night, Liam sat in his apartment, larger now, comfortable, filled with books and photographs and the accumulated evidence of a life well lived, and opened his laptop. There were 43 new story submissions waiting for review. He smiled and began to read, just as he had every night for the past 15 years. The first submission was from a woman in Oregon, writing about her grandfather, who'd served in World War II and never spoke of it. The second was from a man in Florida, writing about his uncle who'd been a combat engineer in Vietnam. The third was from a teenager in Texas, writing about her neighbor, an elderly woman who'd been a pilot in the Women Air Force Service Pilots Program. Each story was a thread, connecting past to present, service to memory, silence to voice. And Liam would make sure every single one was told. 20 years after finding the box, Liam Torres received a letter from the White House. The President of the United States was awarding him the Presidential Citizens Medal for his work preserving veteran stories and honoring forgotten service members. The ceremony would be held in the Rose Garden, with full military honors. Liam almost declined. He didn't want recognition. He didn't want to be celebrated. He wanted to keep doing the work, quietly and steadily, just as Arthur had done. But Sarah convinced him to accept. "It's not about you," she said. "It's about the project. It's about making sure people understand how important this work is. And if you have to stand in front of cameras and shake the president's hand to make that happen, then that's what you do." So Liam went to Washington, wearing the only suit he owned, feeling completely out of place among senators and generals and dignitaries. When the president placed the medal around his neck and shook his hand, Liam thought about Arthur Pendleton, about a tarnished bronze medal wrapped in cloth, about letters tied with string. "Thank you for your service," the president said. Liam smiled. "I'm just the person who remembers. The real service belongs to them." That evening after the ceremony, Liam stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, looking out at the reflecting pool, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. A box in the rain, a choice to stop, a refusal to let a story die. 20 years of work, 3,000 stories documented, thousands more waiting to be told. A movement that had spread across the country, inspiring people to look at their neighbors, their families, their communities, and ask, who are we forgetting? Whose story needs to be told? He pulled out his phone and opened the Last Oaths Project website. The counter at the top showed the current number of documented stories, 3,247. But beneath that number was another counter, one that tracked story submissions still waiting to be reviewed, 1,393. The work would never be finished. There would always be more stories, more voices, more lives waiting to be remembered, and that was exactly how it should be. Because memory isn't a destination, it's a journey. It's a choice we make every day, to see the invisible, to hear the silent, to honor the forgotten. Liam put his phone away and started walking, heading back to his hotel, already thinking about the next story he would tell. 25 years after finding the box, Liam Torres was diagnosed with cancer. The doctors gave him 6 months, maybe a year if the treatment worked. He was 74 years old, had lived a full life, had done work that mattered. He wasn't afraid of dying, but he was afraid of leaving the work unfinished. Sarah came to visit him in the hospital, bringing her laptop and a stack of files. "We need to talk about succession planning," she said gently. Liam smiled weakly. "Always the practical one." "Someone has to be," Sarah replied. "The project needs to continue after you're gone. We need to make sure it's sustainable, that it doesn't depend on any one person." "It never depended on me," Liam said. "It depends on the stories. As long as there are people willing to listen, willing to remember, the project will survive." "But you're the heart of it," Sarah insisted. "You're the one who started it all." "No," Liam said firmly. "Arthur started it. I just happened to be the person who found his story. And now there are thousands of people doing the same thing, finding stories, preserving memories, refusing to let service be forgotten. The project doesn't need me anymore. It's bigger than me." Sarah wiped her eyes. "You're right, but that doesn't make this any easier." Liam took her hand. "I need you to promise me something. When I'm gone, I want my story added to the archive. Not because I did anything special, but because I want people to understand that anyone can make a difference. Anyone can choose to remember. Anyone can refuse to let someone be forgotten. I promise," Sarah whispered. Liam Torres died on a quiet Tuesday morning in March, surrounded by friends and the people whose lives he'd touched. He was 74 years old. His funeral was held in the Last Oaths Garden, beneath the statue of Arthur Pendleton. Over 2,000 people attended. Veterans, families, volunteers, people who'd never met him but whose lives had been changed by the stories he'd helped preserve. Robert Daniels, now 98 years old and in a wheelchair, gave the eulogy. "Liam Torres was a man who saw value where others saw trash," he began, his voice shaking but strong. "He was a man who refused to let silence be the final word. He was a man who understood that every life holds a story worth remembering." He paused, looking at the crowd. "But more than that, he was a man who taught us how to see each other, how to look past the surface, past the ordinary, past the forgetting, and find the extraordinary that exists in every human life. He gestured to the garden, to the hundreds of plaques surrounding them. This is Liam's legacy, not the plaques or the statues or the awards. His legacy is the act of remembering, the choice to stop, to look, to care. And that legacy will live on in every person who decides to honor someone who's been forgotten, in every story that gets told, in every voice that breaks through the silence. Robert looked at the statue of Arthur Pendleton, at the bronze medic carrying his wounded soldier. "Liam carried us all," he said softly, "just like Arthur did, and now it's our turn to carry him." In accordance with his wishes, Liam Torres was buried in the Veterans Cemetery, not far from Arthur and Margaret Pendleton. His headstone was simple: Liam Torres, 1950-2024. He remembered. Beside his grave, the Last Oaths Project placed a small bronze plaque with his story, how he'd been homeless, how he'd found a box in the rain, how he'd spent 25 years making sure forgotten voices were heard. His story became number 3,248 in the archive. 5 years after Liam's death, the Last Oaths Project had documented over 10,000 stories and inspired similar initiatives in 37 countries. The movement he'd started had become global, a collective effort to ensure that service and sacrifice were never forgotten. Sarah Chen, now in her 70s, continued to lead the organization, training new generations of volunteers, expanding the archive and making sure Liam's vision remained at the heart of everything they did. But the most important work happened in small moments, in quiet conversations, in the space between a question and an answer. It happened when a teenager sat down with her grandfather and asked about the war he'd never discussed. It happened when a nurse at a nursing home took an extra moment to listen to an elderly patient's story. It happened when a stranger stopped to help someone everyone else had walked past. It happened every time someone chose to see the invisible, to hear the silent, to remember the forgotten. 30 years after Liam found the box, a young woman named Maya Rodriguez stood in the Last Oaths garden, looking at the statue of Arthur Pendleton. She was 23 years old, a graduate student studying public history, and she'd come to Riverside to research the origins of the Last Oaths Project for her thesis. She'd read every story in the archive. She'd watched every video. She'd interviewed Sarah Chen and dozens of volunteers. But standing here in this garden, surrounded by the physical evidence of 30 years of remembering, she finally understood what Liam had been trying to do. This wasn't just about preserving history. It was about changing how people saw each other. It was about creating a world where service mattered, where sacrifice was honored, where no one had to die alone and forgotten. It was about dignity, connection, humanity. Maya pulled out her phone and opened the Last Oaths Project app. There were 72 new story submissions waiting for review. She smiled and began to read, continuing the work that Liam had started, that Arthur had inspired, that would never truly be finished. Because as long as there were people willing to remember, the forgotten would have a voice. As long as there were people willing to listen, the silent would be heard. As long as there were people willing to stop and look inside a box everyone else called trash, stories would survive. And that was everything.